Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. and I am the host of Reformed GGA. In this video we're going to be going over the second part in our series on multi-role guns, in particular multi-role rifles. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, this series is not meant to show you the one correct way to set up a multi-role gun. I'm just simply showing you the thought process that led to my multi-role gun. In the first video we talked about defining clear goals in terms of what you do want it to do, and also being clear about what you don't want it to do, and then also accepting the fact that whenever you have a multi-role gun, you're going to have to make certain compromises. Compromise, being willing to give up one thing in order to get another, is going to be the name of the game. In this video, we're going to be talking about caliber. And particularly I'm going to be talking about the caliber that I wound up with for my multi-role gun. Excuse me for just a second here. With the whistle, I just finished another video which I went on for about an hour and 40 minutes. And so the throat is just a little dry right now, so forgive me for that. But getting back to the topic at hand, we're talking about caliber. And caliber is probably the biggest issue where I, in setting up my multi-role gun, found that I had to make the most compromises. On the list of things that I said I wanted my multi-role gun to be able to do is it had to be plinkable in 2020. Finding a good plinking gun in 2020 is extremely difficult because any caliber that you would shoot right now, pretty much every caliber has gone up in expense. And there were some calibers that, though they haven't gone up in expense too terribly much, they weren't super affordable to begin with. So how do you find something that's plinkable in 2020? Well, you're not going to find anything that's going to be super great. Your options are going to be a little bit limited. But on top of that, I had other requirements. One of the requirements that I put on there is that it had to be acceptable for use as a bedside self-defense gun. I also said that it had to be suitable for hunting, and I also said that it had to be something that would be viable in a mob type situation, because there's been a bit of that going on in 2020, so it's prudent to at least think about. You try to put all those things together. It needs to be relatively cheap and easy to shoot. I have to be able to take large game with it. It needs to be viable for self-defense, both in a domicile type environment and in something that might be a little bit more open and dynamic. There's going to be some compromise that you have to make. Let's talk about some of the potential candidates that are out there. In 2020, ammo availability is not great, price is definitely not great, but some things have held to be true that have traditionally been true, and one of those is that rimfire, things like 22 LR, 22 short, 22 Magnum, 17 HMR, those kinds of rounds, those tend to be cheaper than the other kinds, and even in 2020 that general truth tends to hold. And so in terms of plinking, rimfire rounds would make a lot of sense. Okay, I need a gun that I can shoot relatively often in 2020 without breaking the bank. Well, a lot of the rimfire rounds are still cheap enough. They might not be awesome prices for rimfire, but I could still manage to shoot a few of them without killing the bank account. But the other requirements that I have, frankly, rule out rimfire. Like I said, there's always one of those things of compromises that need to be made. If you want something that's going to do multiple things, it's not going to be optimized in any one area. So yes, a lot of rimfire ammunition is very commonly available and relatively cheap still, but rimfire ammunition is not really all that great for hunting. It's not really great for self-defense, either within a bedside role or in a mob type situation, just because it's not overly powerful. And also with certain types of rimfire ammunition, you can also deal with reliability issues, especially in certain guns. And so it's not really the best one for those other kinds of roles. So rimfire is kind of off the table to begin with. Okay, so rimfire is off the table. We'll talk about centerfire. Some centerfire options, and have some examples with me, might include things like 9mm pistol round. I could also be talking about, full-size rifle calibers. I like this 7mm Remington here. I don't have the whole bullet. This is just a casing that I found when I was out shooting. But I could do a full-size rifle caliber. I could shoot that. That would certainly be hunting capable and, viable for self-defense in terms of having enough power, etc. That's an option. And then another option that I would have would be intermediate rifle cartridges. They're not as powerful as full-size rifle cartridges, but they're not as weak as pistol rounds either. Something that's kind of in between, like this one that I have here in my left hand, would be 7.62 by 39, and in my right I have 5.56 NATO, 2.23 Remington, very, very similar cartridges. Not exactly the same, especially as it applies to the gun, but very similar. So have intermediate cartridges that I could be dealing with. Could do full-size rifle, or I could do pistol cartridges. Now, in terms of viability for the given things that I need it to do, well, the pistol rounds show up, fall short pretty quickly. Have people defended themselves with pistol rounds? Yes, they have. But pistol rounds typically lack a fair amount of punch, if you will. As far as self-defense is concerned with pistol rounds, the assailant usually has to be hit multiple times. If you go with the Greg Ellerfrit study, it's usually 2 or 3 times that a person has to be hit in the head or torso with a pistol round in order for it to actually effectively stop them. And that's under somewhat normal, fairly ideal conditions. That's not when you're dealing with someone who's excessively angry and got the adrenaline going, or someone who's under the influence of drugs, etc., etc. And that's also assuming that you're able to get in those hits to the head or torso. If you fall outside of those parameters, then pistol rounds really decrease, and they also really decrease with range, especially if you're firing them out of a traditional handgun. Now, putting them in something that's a little bit larger format, like say this CZ Scorpion Evo 3S1, which legally is still technically considered a pistol, but it's a little bit larger format, and so you can get a bit more range out of it. So that does help a little bit, but still, ultimately, they come up a little bit short. Just trying to set this down here safely, and so I'm looking at that instead of looking at you. I apologize. So pistol rounds, like I said, they can stop an attacker, but it usually takes multiple rounds, and there are ways to make them more effective. Put them in something that's a little bit larger format, that's easier to aim, has a little bit longer barrel so you get more kinetic energy, things like that. But they do definitely have limitations. Most pistol rounds, even when you put them in something that's a little bit larger format, are not going to be overly effective past about, say, 50 yards. Now, there are people who are very skilled with them that can get effective hits past that, but you do tend to lose a lot of muzzle energy pretty quickly, so even if you can make accurate hits past 50 yards, they're not always going to be very effective just because they don't have a whole lot of oomph at that point. So, possible to deal with, maybe. Overly effective, not so much. And like I said, it does take multiple hits, and if you're dealing with people who are doing the adrenaline rush thing, or they're on drugs or whatnot, their effectiveness is going to be greatly diminished. Another issue that we're dealing with here in 2020 is that what used to be very common handgun calibers are now super expensive. 9mm right now for this kind of round that's brass case with a fairly standard full metal jacket that has a copper plating on it and lead on the inside. Rounds like this, very simple rounds like this, are going for as much as 60 cents a round. In some cases a little bit higher, in some cases a little bit less. But 60 cents a round is pretty normal right now. That is at least 3 times higher than it was just last year. 60 cents a round is a lot to pay for a round, especially if you want something that's going to be plinking viable. Like I said in my last video, that's one of the requirements I have. So handgun rounds, they're too expensive to really be plinking viable, and they're also not powerful enough to really be good hunting cartridges, especially at any kind of range. And also, because they don't have a whole lot of stopping power, they're not necessarily all that great in a mob type situation either. They might be okay in home defense if you're dealing with a fairly limited number of assailants, say 1 person or 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. But as the number of possible assailants goes up, you really want to have something that's going to pack more of a punch per round so that you're not wasting excess of ammunition. You want to have as few bullets per bad guy, basically. And pistol rounds aren't great for that, so they're, especially 9mm in particular, much more expensive than I'd really want to pay in terms of plinking, and in terms of power, they really don't fulfill the hunting or anti-mob role very well. So rimfire's off the table, and a lot of handgun rounds are also going to be off the table. They're just super expensive right now, especially 9mm is super expensive right now. Some of the other calibers are a little bit less. For example, I've seen some 45 that comes for around 40 cents a round, but that's still a little too expensive for my blood. And a lot of 45 guns don't have a very high capacity, so again, wouldn't be all that great for mob defense and those kinds of things. So handgun rounds are out there, and they can be used in a lot of applications, and they wouldn't necessarily be altogether terrible in them, but because of the range of things that I want my gun to do, it's not going to be what's best for me. When you guys pick a multi-role gun for yourselves and you're going through, okay, what caliber do I want it in? You guys are going to have to think through the same things. What's my budget like? Am I going to be able to practice with this round given my budget? Am I going to be able to afford enough rounds to go out and practice with on a fairly regular basis? That's important. Can you practice with it? But then also on the practical side, is it going to do what I want it to do? Am I worried about going up against a mob? And if that's the case, I want to be able to get as much out of each round as I can. I want every round to count. And with handgun rounds, it usually takes quite a few rounds in order to put an assailant down effectively. That's not great. But again, your concerns might be a little bit different. You might just be concerned about home defense, in which you're dealing with maybe 1 to 5 attackers at most. And if that's the case, handgun round becomes much more viable. Maybe not perfect, but it is much more viable. And you might not be someone who shoots a whole lot. You don't do the recreational shooting thing like I do. I would argue that you should still practice, but some of those concerns might not be as important. Okay? You're going to have to make a sense of the situation and determine what is best for what you want. Hey, just be realistic about it. Me, really low cost so that I can practice a lot is very important, and I also want it to be powerful enough to do a multitude of jobs in very dynamic situations with possibly a high number of assailants. Pistol rounds not going to be so good for that. Center fire is definitely not going to be good for that. One of the other options that I mentioned was full-size rifle cartridges. Well, they pack a whole lot more punch. They really do. Some of these full-size rifle cartridges, not pistol cartridges, full-size rifle cartridges can have more than 3,000 foot-pounds of kinetic muzzle energy. That is a whole lot of energy. Okay, if you get hit by one of these things, you are definitely going to go down. These rounds pack a punch, and they are very effective. So in terms of hunting, they are fantastic for that. But in some of the other roles, they don't do so well. For example, when it comes to plinking, I like to plink, and I've mentioned in the last video that I also like to invite other people to come along and plink with me, and I have a variety of people that shoot with me very often. Sometimes people as young as 8 years old, and sometimes, well over 50 years old. And they all come out shooting with me, and these kinds of rounds are not good for that. One, in terms of cost, these rounds, a lot of them actually haven't gone up a ton in 2020, which is nice. But part of that is because they started kind of high to begin with. It's not uncommon if you're going to buy factory ammunition with these to have to pay more than $1 a round, and sometimes $2 a round, depending on the kind of ammunition, specific kind of ammunition that you're going for. So this right here, which is a 7mm Remington Magnum, very effective cartridge, but it's also expensive. And also, because it is such a big cartridge, it also has a lot of recoil, a lot of kick. And if I'm giving this to an 8-year-old, that might not go over very well. Okay, there are, granted, some stout 8-year-olds out there, but this would kind of be tempting fate a little bit there. That's not going to be an overly pleasant experience for them. So on the plinking side, it's expensive, has a lot of recoil, so it's not going to be all that great for a wide variety of people, or even not just young people, but maybe people who have joint issues and those kinds of things that don't want to deal with the pain of that kind of recoil. Something like this also kind of falls out of the wayside pretty quickly. And another issue with these full-size rifle cartridges is that most of the guns that shoot them are not really going to be very mob capable either. 7mm Remington Magnum is a decent hunting round, but the guns that shoot it are not really designed for use against a mob. Most of them are bolt-action hunting rifles that usually hold no more than 5 rounds. If you've got an entire mob of people attacking you, only 5 rounds in something that you have to manually cycle the action in every single time, probably not a great option. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, there are a lot of .308 rifles out there that are in fact semi-automatic and will have fairly large magazine capacity, like say 20 rounds or something like that. That would be much more viable. But again, something that is that size is going to be typically more expensive, and it also is going to have more recoil that's going to limit who can use it and who can't, at least effectively. So there are some options out there that are better, but for me, in my case, especially because I want that plinkability, I want to have low-cost fun for a variety of people, a lot of those options are still not going to be so great. So full-size rifle cartridges, off the table. So rimfire is not going to be good for me. Pistol rounds aren't going to be good for me. Full-size rifle cartridges aren't really going to be good for me. Now, they might be better options for other people. For example, if you want your multi-roll gun to be primarily set up around hunting or something like that, a full-size cartridge is going to be a lot better. For me, that's more of a minor concern. And like I said last time, you want to make sure you know what all the rolls are, but you also have to understand there's going to be compromises, and you're going to have to make choices about which one of those goals is more important than others. And for me, hunting is not as important as, say, plinkability or use against a mob. So for me, full-size rifle cartridge, not so great. So what that leaves are intermediate rifle cartridges. And the 2 intermediate rifle cartridges that I have here are the 2 that are basically the most common in the US right now. 7.62 by 39, typical AK round, SKS, those kinds of guns, and then 2.23 or 5.56, technically not quite the same cartridge, but very, very, very similar. Much more common in your ARs and also in things like the Bren 2 and a variety of guns that have been produced. These are the 2 most common ones, and those seem to be the options that I have left. You know, rimfire is not reliable enough, in my opinion, for self-defense purposes. Pistol rounds are a little underpowered for certain situations, especially like dealing with a mob or something like that. I want to have something that's much more likely to put an assailant down quickly and immediately so I don't waste rounds. I can conserve my ammo a lot better. I also don't want something that's going to be prohibitive, either in terms of cost or in terms of recoil. So some kind of intermediate cartridge seems to be where I'm going. So these are the 2 most common. These are usually the 2 that are most available. And even in 2020, you still can get both of these cartridges. So what is going to make the difference? Well, for me, because of how much recreational shooting I do by myself and with others, cost is going to be the definitive marker between these 2. And in that case, so far from everything that I've seen, 7.62 by 39 wins. It is the one that is the less expensive of these 2. But that does come with some compromises that need to be made. For one thing, 7.62 by 39 is not as range capable as 2.23 or 5.56. That is, 7.62 by 39 doesn't have quite the same ballistic coefficient. It also doesn't have the same initial velocity, so it doesn't have a super flat trajectory, which means it doesn't tend to do very good at long ranges. Now for me, that's not a huge issue because I'm not a great long-range shooter to begin with. Like I said, I do want it to be hunting capable, but in the environments in which I plan on hunting, in the situations I plan on hunting, I probably wouldn't shoot more than 200 yards. So I don't really need the added advantage that the 2.23 or 5.56 would have. So for me, it's not a big deal. For you though, that might not be the case. You might need that added accuracy. You might need that added range. For me though, low cost and it gets far enough is sufficient for the task. So that's why I picked this one, and it does actually have another advantage as well, in that since it's a lower velocity round with a greater diameter, it tends to be a lot nicer on barrels than 2.23 or 5.56 is. 2.23, 5.56 tends to be a little hard on barrels by comparison. It's a fairly high pressure cartridge. A lot of the cartridges that are out there will run somewhere between 55,000 psi and 62,000 psi in terms of chamber pressure. Some more than that, some less than that. Those are just kind of ballpark numbers. Fairly high in terms of chamber pressure, and that tends to eat out the barrel fairly quickly, especially when you have really small diameter bullets. Given that it's 2020, I can't afford to shoot the expensive stuff very often, so it's probably going to be the steel case stuff, which usually has bimetal jackets, and that's even harder on barrels. 7.62 by 39, because it's a little lower pressure cartridge, a lot of the plinking stuff is only loaded to about 45,000 psi. It's going to be a little bit nicer on barrels, and also has a wider diameter, so the expansive forces tend to be divided out a little bit more. It's not going to be as hard on barrels, not going to tend to eat through them as much. It's not uncommon for 7.62 by 39 guns to go at least 10,000 rounds, even shooting the bimetal jacketed bullets that are hard on barrels. Whereas a 2.23 or 5.56 gun shooting bimetal jacketed bullets can be done in as little as 5,000 rounds, and you've shot out the barrel and you need to replace it. So it's a cheaper round, and it also has better barrel life in most cases, but it's not going to give me the long range accuracy or performance. That's one of the trade-offs that I'm making. For you in your situation, it might be different. Alright, so we've discussed caliber when it comes to multi-role guns. Taking your roles that you want it to fulfill, and then basically deciding which one of those roles are most important. Which ones do you definitely want to meet, and then judging accordingly. For me, low cost because of the plinking thing and practicing has to be a big issue, and I do want it to be capable at range, but that's not as big of an issue as other things. So for me, 7.62 by 39 was the obvious choice. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when they look into getting a multi-role gun, they don't think in terms of caliber first. A lot of times it's whatever is cool hanging on the shelf. But this is what you're actually shooting. This is what you're doing the work with. Okay, how cool the gun looks on the shelf doesn't matter. How ballistically effective it is or isn't, and what effect it has on your pocketbook or doesn't, is actually what's going to matter a lot more. So I would suggest that when you're determining your multi-role gun, that you start by thinking about what caliber is going to be best for you long term, in terms of cost, but also in terms of effectiveness, and how effective does it need to be in each one of those roles. Thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.